The distribution centers in Star Citizen's latest patch 3.23 are so big that they could nearly be considered landing zones. They're vast and sprawling facilities, both on their interiors as well as exteriors, and they promise to offer a variety of new and exciting gameplay opportunities both in 3.23 as well as in future patches. Today, I wanted to take a closer look at its master plan and overall design and talk about its successes and shortcomings. If by the end you enjoyed this video and think I deserve it, please don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button to show your support. What strikes me most on approach is its angular design both in elevation and in plan, drawing your eyes upwards to the Owning Corporation's logo and the enormous pinnacle. Starting from afar I think also helps you gain an appreciation for just how large the facility is. It really is sprawling, and it doesn't just include the main complex around that large structure in the distance. There are also outlying facilities in which there are other activities that take place in the game, and that's going to be our first stop. The distribution center outlying facilities aren't large by any means, but they're big enough to have a variety of smaller scale gameplay. Complete with defenses and a perimeter, it makes for a much more interesting approach when approaching from the air or on the ground, and I played a mission here where it was indeed defended. I'll be posting some general gameplay later when the game is a bit more stable. It didn't look great. Now in terms of the location's purpose, I can't be certain, but given that there's an underground facility nearby, it's perhaps an alternate location to come up from the underground areas, although that's not currently in 3.23. It's also possible that it could just be a security outpost or a maintenance outpost. I'm excited to see how this could connect with the main facility in the future outside of just an architectural relationship. But now as we take off, let's head towards the main facility, which is really the focus of the video. As I alluded to at the beginning of the video, it's not just the elevation that's angled, but also the master plan of the facility. You'll see that all of the exterior spaces are laid out angular to the central complex in a rather logical way. Cargo transportation roads lie adjacent to landing pads for loading cargo ships, with a larger cargo pad located underground for more secure loading. And you'll also notice just adjacent to these pads the new cargo lifts, which unfortunately did not make it into the first release of 3.23. But you'll notice that the lift doors are still there. It's good to see that they considered this as part of the design of the facility when making it. This logical master plan layout then makes navigating the facility a lot more easy once you understand its general organizing principle, but if you're ever confused on where you are, you can always just look up and find that massive center facility and know that's the direction you need to go. Despite that though, once you're down and on the ground, it still makes for a very interesting FPS experience when engaging other players or hostile NPCs. And the designers really successfully played off that industrial design to deploy things like catwalks to offer a variety of different vantage points to shoot from and be shot from, creating a lot more angles than you might be used to if you've played Star Citizen's bunkers before. But it's in my view done in a tasteful way that feels like it fits within the lore of the game. The distribution center would have things like catwalks and higher vantage points for more practical purposes, like accessing different parts of the refinery for maintenance and so forth. But I'm also really just inspired by the layout of things, because it seems like they've got some ideas for the future on how gameplay can work, such as using this loading area to perhaps load ground vehicles, perhaps a cargo truck on the Atlas platform? I'm not sure. But whether or not they finally connect to real gameplay in the future, just thinking about what spaces are used for definitely helps drive a much more believable layout, like the security checkpoint here that leads into the lower part of the facility. But now I want to return down to the human level because while a bird's eye view gives you a great look at the facility's master plan, its scale can only really truly be appreciated while on foot. Such as here on the main access road that leads up to the facility's inner storage area. Or here a bit closer near the ramp that leads up to the security checkpoint that leads into the inner part of the facility. The enormous attention to detail by the designers here have helped to emphasize the scale and give a better reading of it from a distance or here on foot, by placing recognizable objects in smaller buildings with doorways and catwalks. We can visually understand the scale of this facility. But of course, this was necessary given that this is a location that's going to feature a multitude of missions that players are surely going to explore a great deal of, and so it was certainly necessary in order to meet player expectations. Reaching the top of the ramp towards the east exit point, we finally arrived at our ingress point to explore the interior of the facility. One thing you may notice though is that the roads lead into the facility, and they've actually separated the circulation between vehicles and foot traffic. There's actually a smaller entrance just to the right of the main vehicle entrance to go through where you'd pass through security if it actually existed in this version of the game. We know from their CitizenCon presentation that they have plans to make these facilities gated through reputation, where you'll have to work your way up the chain in order to get access to further parts of the facility. So you'll notice throughout our tour that the designers are considering this future gameplay intention by designing a number of security checkpoints where your reputation will surely be checked. What really struck me about this space though on entry is how it's angular, like the exterior of the building, showing that the designers tried to continue the language from the exterior to the interior to make the whole facility feel like it was designed with a single vision in mind, and that's not something that even happens that often in real life, unfortunately. But I appreciate the design consistency. Here at this vehicle entry point, we also have additional security stations for checking vehicles as they come in, and the road you may also notice is staggered on entry, providing a little bit more time and safety for security to respond if a vehicle were to try to rush past this checkpoint. There are also ample barriers for cover to allow for security personnel to take cover in the event of an armed assault, so there's a lot of consideration here for gameplay and also just practical purposes. But now as we dive deeper into the facility, I want to call your attention to a specific part of this design that I've talked about a little bit earlier, about the scale of the design's exterior. One thing that Star Citizen hasn't done particularly well in the past is match their interiors to their massive exterior designs. For example, the stations in Star Citizen are huge, but when you step inside, it really doesn't feel like it. It seems to me at least that the designers for the distribution centers were aware of this issue and tried to follow up that massive exterior with an equally grand, massive interior to an extent. I say this because there's one particular space in this facility that doesn't feel as grand as it did in the concept art. But before we get there, I also just want to say how much this facility gives me Half-Life vibes. If you've played Half-Life before, you know what I'm talking about. This feels like it could be straight out of Black Mesa. And I would be shocked if some of the developers who worked on this weren't inspired by that in some way. I also want to call attention to the incredible looking doors that they designed for the facility, which really fit the thick and heavy industrial aesthetic that they were going for. Even the sounds feel chunky and appropriate for them. It's these subtle details that really sell the effect as a whole. If one small part falls short, it can ruin the experience in a way that might not be as obvious to the user. That's definitely a challenge in critiquing things. It's easy to say when something doesn't feel right, but much harder to say why. So I'm glad to say that the interior, at least of this entry, feels right. And leveraging Star Citizen 3.23's new map system for the interior reveals a pretty logical layout. I love this system, by the way, and it's really going to change the way I do reviews, I think, in the future. It's going to give me a better chance to understand a ship or location's layout much more accurately and in detail. Deeper into the facility, though, we're going to finally arrive at one of the interior's most important spaces for gameplay, at least, and that's the storage area where you'll be tasked with going and retrieving certain items, or in the event of doing a raid mission, you'll be tasked with going in and stealing items, though those raid missions aren't currently in 3.23. But once we step inside, you may be a little bit surprised at the scale of the space. Now, by Star Citizen standards, it's pretty big, but as a distribution center, it feels like it falls just a little bit short of wowing me with scale. This is definitely a limitation of the engine and the amount of work developers are able to do, but I think they could have done something like extend space to a lower area that you can't actually access, just to make this area feel a lot bigger than it is. Now, in lore, it seems that these boxes are on conveyor belt racks that come through the floor, so there's a larger storage area down below that we can't see, but it's more about the visual effect and feeling as opposed to explaining it away with lore. But all told, this is a minor nitpick and I'm not too bothered by it. The interior space is really well designed. I like the conveyor belt box idea and how it makes these boxes accessible. It feels appropriately futuristic, and actually the whole space feels like it fits within the facility really. So I don't think most people would be bothered by this, and like I said, it's just a nitpick. One of the really cool and exciting things that they started doing with this facility though that I want to call your attention to are these maintenance hatchways that exist below the platforms and to the side, and you wouldn't notice them unless you were looking for them. These are going to offer really great opportunities for gameplay in the future for sneaking through the facility if you're not welcome there, but it's also just cool to have them in lore, as you would likely have these types of maintenance access ways for these large facilities with heavy machinery and lots of moving parts. There's a lot of space to explore here, so if you've not been to one of these yet in 3.23, it's definitely worth checking out just to see what there is to see. Opposite to the storage area is an on-call area for the workers of the Kovalek shipping hub or any other facility owner. And it's cool that they added this type of thing in, as it's not something that the player would necessarily use, but it's something that you would expect to see and certainly gives another area for some interesting interactions and mission possibilities. These locations are more about immersing you in the environment and creating a believable atmosphere, and I think it does a fantastic job of that. The last major stop here on this lower section of the facility is the elevator room. This is where in the future it's planned that a large lift will bring players and vehicles down to the lower section of the facility underground to mines and manufacturing areas that's going to offer a variety of even more interesting gameplay. It was easily the coolest part of the inner facility's concept art when they first revealed it, and it feels like they got really darn close to nailing that look. The only thing that I think it doesn't do particularly well is deal with the area just below the control room, where it feels just a bit too cluttered and breaks up the scale of the space on the lower level. Taking a look at the original concept art, they were able to capture the essence, I think, of the concept, but I think they missed out on a really important point that I saw with this, and that's the scale around that control room. It doesn't really capture that as well. Concept art can be a great way to start visualizing geometry and spatial relationships, but I also think that it's supposed to communicate a feeling, and I don't get exactly the same feeling from the real facility as I do from these. The scale here feels a lot more epic and grand than in the real thing. I don't think it's just the prop clutter either. I think the size of the control room may also be just a little bit too big relative to the scale of the space. But the designers still managed to pull off some really nicely framed views through some select locations, such as here as you exit from the security checkpoint from the upper levels. It's just unfortunate that that feeling and look is lost when you're actually standing within the space. Perhaps when they get the elevator operational, it'll be an opportunity to come back and maybe scale the space up a little bit, or perhaps the elevator itself will just afford another area for the player to stand within to better appreciate the space as it's been designed. This main elevator lobby though is flanked on either sides by 2 levels of corridor, and this is probably my favorite circulation path design in the whole of the underground area. It provides a great vantage point to view the elevator lobby from, but it's also just got some really cool design elements like the angular designed hallway and the yellow accents on both the stairs as well as the hallway structural elements that are spaced evenly across its length. But it's on this upper level that you gain access to the security checkpoint for accessing the upper levels of the facility, the administrative offices. And this, once again, is a design response to a feature gameplay intention of gating off areas in accordance to your reputation with the owning organization. In terms of design, I think it's been done really successfully. You've got your security office with an armory, your security gates, and a big locking door in case somebody tries to run through. But it also doubles as a compression space before you enter that much larger elevator lobby just beyond, and it frames it really well through that window which I showed you earlier, so all of this seems very intentional. And it all works together to make that final reveal of seeing the elevator lobby a bit more magnificent and epic. And it really demonstrates the designer's understanding of procession when designing spaces, using form to create intentional experiences and framed views. But there's still much yet left to see here on the upper levels, so let's get to it. And rather than enter the upper part of the facility through this lower elevator access, I want to enter as you might if you were an executive from the upper levels flying into the small landing pads. A moment ago I mentioned procession, and if you're a longtime viewer of the channel, you'll probably be familiar with this term, but just to refresh your memory, it describes the way users move through space, and understanding procession as a designer helps you leverage the shape of a space and its plan layout to create better experiences for the user. For example, here on the landing pad, there's this outstretched area where you can look over the building's size and scale. They were clearly considering how players might want to view the building from a really cool vantage point. Or here how they've utilized the building's design language to create an outstretched enclosure overhang or arch that's a classical way of signifying entry. The only strange bit about it is that it doesn't really protect the user as they approach the final entry point. I may have maybe extended that over a bit to the right as you approach the building's mass in order to provide additional shelter. But this is a personal preference point, and I think that the gesture is done well. On approach, a couple of things strike me though. First is that the exterior here feels a little bit empty. I would have liked to have seen some planters and maybe seated areas just to make the space feel a little bit more filled out. And the entry point here with these doors feels a little bit anticlimactic. I feel like the doors could have been a bit bigger to create a bit more drama as you enter. I mean, it's a very dramatic building in the first place, so it just feels like they don't connect. But once you get into the building, it's another story. The space definitely feels like it's related to the exterior. It's expressing concrete in a very intentional way, which by the way is an excellent material to use in this context, as concrete leverages a lot of local materials, and that's probably what you'd want to do instead of transporting everything you need to another planet. But I also think in terms of tone, the interior space here feels a lot more high class than on the lower levels. While concrete is generally perceived as being an industrial material, exposing it in this fashion is actually really expensive in the real world and requires a lot of intention with, really clean and beautiful formwork. But here on this main hallway, the program is really well situated. Just to the left as you enter is an employee locker room and bathroom where you can deposit your articles before you go on duty. Again, it looks like they're really thinking about how the space would be used in this context, and I really want to commend them for making this space feel really believable. And just like on the lower levels, there's also an employee rest area, although this one's for executives, so it's a lot higher end than on those lower levels. I mean, there's a nice bar area, wood floors, a lowered warm seating area with low 3000K lighting to make it feel intimate, and even a glass barrier to give it a little bit more acoustic comfort. And just beyond that, there's a series of rest areas for employees to take a nap on long shifts. It's all really well done and well considered, although the single small toilet here feels a bit tiny for the amount of beds that are here, but this isn't meant for long-term use. It's only meant for a short-term nap. It's a break room, so I can forgive it for that. But the real wow moment of the space is when you enter the main lobby. Depending on which complex you're entering and who owns it, the interior design's color scheme and general layout will be slightly different, but mostly all of the facilities, regardless of manufacturer, share the same really impressive architecture, this massive skylight that looks up onto that big tower that you saw from a distance, and it really drives your eyes to that central reception for the facility. This to me does a much better job than that elevator lobby of matching the scale and grandeur of the exterior. But that may just come down to the fact that they've got windows here and that extends the space outward. But they've also done a fantastic job of using both materials as well as these short half walls and planters to break down the larger space into a much more interesting interior where you can have larger or smaller interactions. And those massive windows, the skylights and side windows, bring a ton of light into the interior and make it feel light and airy in a way that you might not expect looking at a massive concrete complex like this. The only downside is that it makes some of the landing zone's interiors feel a bit dated. After all, CIG are constantly honing in and refining their skills, and this really shows off how far they've come. Looking at the concept art though, there are some things that I think could be done a little bit better, but some of it's a limitation of the current engine. The lighting unfortunately isn't quite as good as this rendering here, and I think this will just have to wait until we get ray traced global illumination. But I'm also a little bit disappointed we didn't get this really cool floor texture here. It really reminds me of Frank Lloyd Wright's famous Ennis home in LA. It was featured in a lot of movies, including Blade Runner. You may recognize it as Deckard's home. Dude did some pretty nice digs, actually. Just like on the lower levels though, the upper executive area also has some gated entry points for the future planned reputation system, which leads to some more interesting spaces where I'm sure we're going to be given some missions to take in the future. Back here are elevators and security. The elevators will take us down to that lower area that we've already been to that security checkpoint, either on the left or right side, the west or east side of the complex. Here there's also a security office just behind the front counter, which I'm sure is eventually going to be off limits, but you can access right now in the current build of 3.23. But now I want to return to the lobby and take a look at that upper level because there's still some pretty cool things to check out. Like these massive slanted windows that look out over the entire complex, giving you a phenomenal view of what's going on down below as well as the surrounding landscape. It'll be pretty neat in the future to see players loading and unloading cargo here from this vantage point. Heading to the rearmost part of the lobby, there's another raised area with another window that looks out from a different direction, but the coolest part of this upper area are the ASOP terminals, which give you access to the 2 large hangars available at these facilities. Opposite the ASOP terminals is yet another private section of the executive suites. Here you'll find the main executive office, as well as a conference room and elevators to presumably what will eventually be other areas to this large facility, which are currently not accessible. What's really cool about this space though is this gigantic waterfall that spans the remaining distance to the pinnacle of the tower. Very much, once again, following the slanted design language of the building's exterior, making for an extra dramatic space. I also like how the accent lights accentuate the texture of the concrete. Moving into the conference room, I really like how they've broken it down into 3 spaces: a reception area, a lounge area, and a meeting table, and they're all separated using the floor as well as some suggestions with a glass barrier and some vertical fin elements. While all 3 spaces are connected visually, they're also separated visually. And I once again love the expression of concrete in a very intentional way. Moving on to the executive suite just adjacent to that, it's pretty much identical, only the meeting table is replaced by a large executive desk. The lounge area is the same and it has this great view out onto the main lobby as well as an adjacent skylight. It allows the executive then to look down on those employed below them. It's a very subtle suggestion of authority. Overall then, I feel like the lobby space does a fantastic job of feeling related to the overall architecture as well as the industrial area, but doing it in a way that feels also separate and higher level, more suitable for the executives in charge of these locations. But there's one other thing I wanted to show you guys that you may have seen only on the periphery throughout our tour, and that's the maintenance ways located in secret locations scattered about the complex. If you look closely, you'll find some little hatches behind flower pots and in floors behind office doors where you'll gain access to the lower maintenance areas of the facility. And all of them are connected to the exterior, allowing you to actually get into the facility without being detected, tying into the reputation gameplay that's planned to happen so that in the event that you don't have good rep with a company, you could still sneak in to complete your objective, say for an assassination mission or obtaining sensitive documents from the administrator's main office, or even maybe just plain maintenance missions. It's a full labyrinth that connects the facility in a really interesting way that's worth exploring if you've not been here yet. So I'm not going to give you guys a full tour of this lower area. Some of this is just something that you probably need to check out for yourself. After all, discovery is one of the most exciting parts of playing something for the first time, and I don't want to ruin everything for you. I'm just excited to see that they've added something that's so cohesive in terms of design into the game that at the same time is also well designed for future gameplay opportunities. The only big downside to their implementation in 3.23 is that there's not a whole lot of gameplay that's leveraging their locations. There are some missions to do here, including FPS missions and Find Me missions, but in terms of all that stuff we talked about regarding reputation and even mission chains, as that would imply, don't yet exist. And so they're more of just a really cool and novel place to visit for now, with some exciting FPS missions that occasionally occur here. When the cargo updates come online and more of these reputation features come online, that's when I think these places will truly shine. I just wish that they could shine along with their initial release. But what are your thoughts? How do you guys like these new distribution centers? Have you visited them yet? Are you looking forward to visiting them? And what kind of gameplay can you imagine happening here? Personally, I'm very excited to see how they could use these locations for PvP events. Perhaps one location needs to be held by an org in order to capture its valuable resources. I don't know, I think there's a ton of possibilities. Whatever you think though, I hope to see you guys in the next one.